All right, guys. This is an interesting video someone sent me. It's called Charlie Kirk repeatedly schools anti-American socialist Vaush. I think this conversation is from a while back, but I'm interested in like the review on the conversation from this person, Rattlesnake TV. You know, two people that I'm not a particular fan of, Charlie Kirk and Vaush. So I have no biases here, except from a dirty liberal. Let's see what we got here. I'm curious. Let's go.
I think that dealing drugs is a person's freedom for the peasantry of the time, no matter what.
See, that's where I disagree. Because when was the first state to abolish slavery? Vermont in 1777. Why?
Well, kids can't sign contracts.
So there's nothing. I don't know
see
what's
what I'm
happening.
getting at? Eventually, you do agree that a conservative framework is necessary.
In this video,
Whoa!
we are going to cover a debate between Charlie Kirk and socialist streamer Vaush. Now, Vaush has been covered on this channel before, and you guys will know that I have my issues with him. He can be a little bit duplicitous, in my opinion, but props to him for having this debate. And they cover some very interesting topics, so let's get into it.
We can talk about what's happening in schools, the things they're teaching children, and I don't know if either of you has an opinion and wants to start off with...
The floor is yours.
Yeah, so there are two CRTs. There's the critical race theory that I know of, which is a highly esoteric, essentially elective class that you can take in some law schools that teaches you a variety of incredibly eclectic legal theories that some of which I like and some of which I think I disagree with. And then there's the critical race theory that people like Christopher Rufo have been trying to push, a sort of catch-all term to describe all anti-racism. We see these
Yeah, listen, when it comes to whatever critical race theory is, it does seem difficult to define, at least from what I see. I don't, like, as long as it doesn't teach people that they are bad for like the color of their skin, like it shouldn't teach like white people that they're bad for the sins of white people in the past. It shouldn't teach that there's something inherent to white people that makes them bad, and it shouldn't teach somebody that just because they're like non-white means that they have to be a victim, right? There's a difference between teaching that like there is different forms of oppression associated with race because of the way that our society has been set up, versus saying that everybody can identify with that, right? Because I wouldn't want to, you wouldn't really want to implement like a victim complex in anybody either. And I think that's it. As long as they adhere to that, I don't care.
CRT bills being put through straight legislators, and a lot of them don't even mention critical race theory. They mention stuff that's been boilerplate anti-racist theory for like 2 centuries. That stuff really concerns me. If I think that academia is to an extent sacred, of course, all the good things in our society now were born in the halls of academia. The Enlightenment, our democracy, the fair trial that we enjoy if we're arrested, these were things that were originally considered to be the crackpot initiatives of academics, and only through the respect of those ideas have we arrived at, well, what we have today. So if there are problems within academia, I would have them solved in academia, not through the big hand of government reaching in and censoring everyone who says something that disagrees with some political party.
So a point of clarification, you don't believe that critical race theory is in schools?
I think that maybe there are ideas which overlap with critical race theory, but there's always going to be overlap between academic ideas. I mean, I drank water, so did Hitler, one of those type situations.
I think you're...
Well, I mean, sure, like critical race theory is supposed to be anti-racist. That might go too far, right? So, like, if we're having a discussion about, if you're having just a broad scale discussion about anti-racism in school, of course, there's going to be some things that overlap. Sure.
Coming at it from in good faith, where you're technically correct here that super academic way of defining critical race theory is not being taught to 4th graders, right? With that being
so, it'd be pretty.
With that being said, there are. It's almost like saying, we're not teaching advanced geometry to 4th graders, but we are teaching them, very basic math, right? We'll get them the Euclidean geometry. So the very basics of this are definitely in schools, and there's.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I understand what Charlie's saying, and I just think I don't particularly care for the argument. Okay, so what we're saying is, hey, listen, there's a degree to critical race theory. It's founded on anti-racism, and then maybe it goes too far to blaming white people. I think that's probably the general conservative take. And what Charlie's saying is that, like, it sounds like, what he's saying, is that, like, it's still bad because it teaches some of the fundamentals of critical race theory, even though those fundamentals aren't wrong. Right, that's what he's using the math comparison. It's like, we're not teaching advanced geometry, but you're teaching 1 + 1, and that's a pathway to potentially learn advanced geometry. It's like, sure, but I don't think that makes it a negative that people are learning about some aspects of critical race theory, So
many examples of this, right?
It's one of those things where you'd say like, it's just the starting to this thing. I would say like, too much of anything is bad. right? It's like, is milk bad for you? Probably not. Is you drinking a gallon in a minute bad for you? Yeah, certainly so. Just where it's like, is anti-racism good? Yes. Can it go too far to blaming like white people or something? Yes. Or victimizing black people? Yes. Right. So I go with more of like, teach it in moderation, but don't overfill your cup of milk. You'll start puking. Right.
National Education Association literally came out in their press release and said that they are going to push for, and their word was critical race theory, just so we're clear. They use that term, right?
Okay.
That's not Christopher Rufo, that's not James Lindsay, who are good friends of mine. That's the National Education Association, right? And I think they might even be talking about something different than the Delgado theory of critical race theory, right? And so what I want to try to do here, Tim, is we can talk about critical race theory as an academic theory, or we could use a filler term like wokism, which is more like racial justice, which I actually think would probably be, we can call it racial justice and meet in the middle. Right?
I really feel like there are probably 4-digit number of people in America who are studied on actual critical race theory, not including myself.
And I'm not even prepared to do that. But I'm happy to talk about racial justice education.
So Charlie basically nails it there with that description. And this is a perfect way to think about it. Critical race theory is a worldview, and it's largely a grooming process that starts at a very young age.
Okay, listen. Bro, I was not expecting that. Okay, so here's the thing. Is yes, technically you could argue that it is grooming. But it wouldn't be predatory grooming. And the problem that I have with people using the term grooming on the internet is that like when you use it, you're generally trying to take that incredibly intense emotional energy in the way that we talk about grooming in an online sense. And you're trying to apply it here and make it seem like what's happening is predatory. If you're going to say that that's grooming, I would just say that religion is grooming too, in a non-predatory sense. There can be instances where it becomes predatory, but I would generally say that's like conditioning. I think is a better internet word to use, since we're like, and I feel like it's intentional that he uses that choice of word. I think that there's supposed to be a negative inflection. It's supposed to be seen as a bad thing, and it's supposed to be seen as dangerous. But we're comparing the learning of like anti-racism that might go too far to actually children getting assaulted, right? And we understand that. And it's so, it feels like it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Conservatives, progressives, everybody seems to have like a vested interest in diminishing what actual grooming is. And it's just weird to me.
And this is something I often discuss on this channel.
What is grooming? He's arguing teaching kids anti-racism is grooming to teach kids about critical race theory. Yeah.
I've done a whole video on the history and the origins of woke ideas. So I'll leave that recommended at the end for you guys. But basically, what these ideas are creating is young people who are coming out of these university institutions like greyhounds out of the starting gate, trying to find racism absolutely everywhere.
That's true. He's not wrong about that. Everybody is now looking for racism. And if you look for something, you will find it, but not necessarily in its purest sense. Remember, we used to find lots of fool's gold. Sometimes we found real gold too. Not a lot of fool's gold, right? And I think that there is fool's gold racism. I just coined that right now. Tell me I'm smart. Tell me I'm the best. Never back down, never what? But it really does boil down to like a fool's gold racism. We're looking for racism, and so we're finding it. Even if it's not necessarily racism, right? And that's a problem. We shouldn't be looking at it as like an attempt to find it socially. We should just be looking at it in a way we're like aware of it and like, oh, this could be racist, and have conversations. So,
but more importantly, they're coming out of these institutions thinking that Western civilization as a whole is a terrible thing. Everything is patriarchal and misogynistic, and capitalism is evil and what?
Well, let's be very clear again. Some things are patriarchal, and I think that there's a proper way to acknowledge that in a way that's constructive and productive. Some things are bad capitalism. I mean, not for nothing, but when medication and health insurance costs are so insane and rich people have tons of money, like it's hard to. I mean, I see why people say capitalism is bad. They're horribly upcharging people to like these really heavy degrees. I mean, like, yeah, I could see why people are disenfranchised with capitalism. when there's less and less worker protections and more money at the top. You know, I get it.
People are horrible and terrible. They're not being taught critical race theory in the more legal academic sense, but they are being taught to develop a critical consciousnness. And this, in my opinion, is a lot worse because it's subversive. And it's
no, like critical consciousness. I mean, it doesn't sound bad. The problem is none of these people are critically thinking, right? They're being told about critical race theory, but they're not actually having a constructive critical anything. They're just assumed, like, that's the bigger problem. I think that in some instances, these people aren't being taught critical race theory or being taught to be critical at all about anything. In the same way where a lot of like religious people aren't taught to be critical about the Bible and the negatives to it, is the same way that like it comes to when we teach people about racism, and sometimes it goes too far, right? But I don't think that actual critical learning is a great thing. People actually understand what they're talking about, because that's why a lot of progressives that are at college universities get rolled on very basic topics. Because when a conservative shows up, because they don't know how to defend their perspective, because everybody just agrees with them, right? And that's one of the problems there. So
it's designed to systematically brainwash very malleable young people. At least if they were being taught critical race theory as a subject, they would be being honest about it. But that's what happens when your ideas don't stand up to public scrutiny. You have to implant it into children whilst their parents' backs are turned.
We're getting a little anti-homophobic. Listen, just to be clear, and any of these things can be said about religion. I don't know what you know what I mean. So let's just be like clear. Let's stay away from some of that speak, right? You fundamentally are going to teach kids things to help prepare them for the world. That doesn't mean that everything that's being taught to them is some kind of predatory situation going on. Let's just be like explicitly clear about that. That's how we like. It's like, oh, teaching math is bad because why? Because they're kids. You know, it's like, okay. And then you kind of flashed on the screen as you were saying like that we're teaching kids. You flashed on a screen like BLM and fucking gay pride shit. But,
and now a bit more about racism, anti-racism, and I'll give a little bit more context afterwards.
Okay. Let's go to just piece,
yeah, sure.
issue by issue. Ibram X. Kendi, who's kind of one of the, archangels of the wokism movement.
Beloved figure in the minds of conservatives and liberals alike.
So Ibram X. Kendi, and I'm paraphrasing, and you guys could pick up the quote, is that we need discrimination today because there was discrimination yesterday. That's the essence of the quote, right,
Well, that's
Tim?
silly.
Yeah, he said the only solution for past discrimination is present discrimination, and the only solution for present discrimination is future discrimination.
So
I mean, that's an interesting thing if I'm being charitable. If I'm being not charitable, what I would say is that person is looking to discriminate against people who used to be in power or the representatives of them. So, like, let's discriminate against white people in the same way they did to us. If I'm being charitable, I would say what they're talking about when it comes to discrimination is something like quotas, right? Like a race quota would be considered a form of discrimination, but you're doing it because you've had a historical society that has decided that like black and other people aren't allowed to have a job, so you have to create a quota to force them into that job because people's minds obviously are too, I guess, racist to be able to hire correctly without some kind of a racial bias. And so you implement a quota, which is technically discrimination, with the idea being until it got to the point where people wouldn't be discriminated against. So if he means like that, like racial quotas, I get it. And this, of course, is not perfect. Are people going to be passed up on a job that they are more qualified for? Yeah, for sure. But then there's also probably a lot of people who are perfectly qualified for the job that are actually getting it that wouldn't have gotten it before that just because they were a different color. Right, so that maybe that's what he's talking about, but I don't know. That really depends on how you look at it. It's certainly not I would say probably the worst way to communicate that line. It's probably meant to be shocking. So.
I find that to be reprehensible. What say you?
I think it's misguided in large part because I don't believe if there was some god who could just distribute all resources in a perfectly ordained way and did so at the snap of a finger, then maybe that would be a decent argument. In the real world, we have to go through politics, and any kind of discriminatory treatment under any circumstances, no matter how well intentioned, is going to have adverse effects. So, with regard to what he said, there is a very charitable interpretation, and that charitable interpretation is. Discriminatory practices in the past necessitate favorable practices today, a way of bringing people up. My reparations argument, I mean, the poor in this country have always had it bad, at least worse than they could otherwise. That is essentially a version of that argument. Preferable treatment towards the poor. We do this with welfare because there are systemic barriers keeping them from full participation.
The next question then is, should we be teaching first and second and third graders to be hyper conscious aware of race all the time?
That's a good question. I don't know. Because on the one hand, you'd say, like, of course, you want to teach people against racism as young as possible. But then on the other hand, it's like, can like those kids actually understand what the fuck is being taught to the degree where they're actually going to be engaging with this correctly? Or are they just going to learn the bare bones of it in a way where they're just going to create hatred? Like, are kids capable of that kind of critical thought to be able to understand racist structures without hating on all white people or victimizing all black people? So that's an interesting question. Yeah, I don't know. Probably not. I would lean towards. I feel like people are dumb as fuck. You know, maybe I'm wrong, but you know, I think that we start in those grades. You know, you start with, hey, don't be mean to black people. You know, and they're like, wow, based. You know, they're like, wow, I can't believe what a base thing to say.
I think that's destructive. I think it goes against the American promise of e pluribus unum, of caring more about character than skin color. And yes, Martin Luther King Jr. was a mixed bag when it came to this stuff.
He's a cool guy.
But he was a very radical socialist in some regard, but he really hit it perfectly when he said that this was the ideal of the American system. Do you see any downsides to getting 3-year-olds just caring, not 3-year-olds, third graders caring about the color of people's skin all the time?
Well, I could see third graders. What are you in third grade? Like you're 9? Am I right about my math? Yeah, like you might be a little too young to understand the course material. Sure, I could see that. But that's the thing. Is that the argument from conservatives, or is that like the hide and go seek argument? Is that the reasonable argument when they just really don't want to teach any critical race theory, or is that like, hey, I just don't think these young people are capable of engaging with this correctly? You know, probably depends on who you're talking about. So
I think depending on their environment, they might already, whether they know it or not, in very implicit and subtle ways. We know from tests done, for example, on like little kids, like 4-year-olds or whatever, that some elements of implicit racial bias already infect their thinking. Now, that isn't a moral judgment. We're all flawed beings. We live and we die. We all have biases. That is just a part of life. But I think conversation...
Are you really living if you've never kissed a femboy, though? Are you?
Conversations about those things can be valuable. I don't believe we live in a colorblind world, so teaching people that we do can often lead them to remain ignorant to evident problems. Now, to what extent would you be comfortable, what would you say, like bringing a racial consciousness?
Interesting. So my wife in the chat says, I feel like the way I was taught was good, like something I remember from elementary school, and the author who wrote Something Beautiful came and read the book and did an understanding in depth, or and read the book. And did I understand it in depth? No. But it did point out that little black girls can be beautiful. And not that I didn't believe that before the book, but I just didn't think of it, and it made sense. And that makes sense to me because like that is one thing where a lot of representation, at least when like my wife and I were growing up, we're like, 29, 30, we're basically both 30. Is like there was a lot of white representation in beauty, not a lot of black representation in beauty. And so just to tell a kid like black girls can be beautiful, it's a very basic idea, and it's like, oh yeah, cool. And it's just it's one of those things where like kids are just not necessarily, and nowadays it might be different, but kids may not necessarily be seeing all this type of representation of like, oh, black girls can be beautiful. And so just kind of like saying that can be like, oh, like I didn't think of it, and that sounds so silly, but I think that that's an interesting, yeah, sure, okay.
That's to third graders.
For me, very little to none. As don't care about it, de-emphasize it, look at the spirit, the soul, the conduct, and the character of the human being. Their skin color means nothing. Not saying that you should start to emphasize, organize what people look like, because therefore it means something that we're going to tell you. A great example is that this is the textbook definition of stereotyping, right? Is that if you see a black person, you don't know their history. You don't know if they're the son of a Nigerian billionaire. You don't know if they're an immigrant.
Hey. I once gave $1,000 to the son of a Nigerian billionaire. And I'm just waiting on my return of $100,000. So, frankly, I got very lucky getting that email. Let's be real.
Immigrant from Turks and Caicos, and you don't know if they're the 9th generation descendant of slaves, right?
Sure.
There's been 2 million blacks that have come to America legally through the immigration process since 1980. So this sort of hyper fixation on race.
So Ibram X. Kendi, who changed his name from Ibram Henry Rogers.
I agree with the fundamentals of what Charlie Kirk's saying. We can't just assume everybody's a victim on a personal sense, but on like a systemic sense, we should have a decent understanding of what's going on.
Because I guess that doesn't quite have the same revolutionary ring to it, is the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, a book that you may remember featured heavily on the Instagram stories of white girls after George Floyd's death.
I just remember seeing a black square. But
he's one of the primary race hustlers and has become very wealthy off of white guilt and off of promoting actual discrimination and racism rather than unity and love of the other. And his quote that they referred to was, the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only
that kind of makes sense to me.
remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination.
Oh.
The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination.
If it starts with the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination, then like it's pretty explicitly clear that they're referring to like different types of yeah. I mean, that I kind of agree with that. Might not be the only solution, but it sounds like they're effectively just saying like, it just sounds like they're saying that we need to implement like different racial quotas. So that's fine.
Sounds like a very productive cycle, right? He's not a cool guy and not somebody who should be listened to, in my humble opinion. But there are some fantastic voices out there. Activists who I think are doing a good job. I'm a big fan of Killer Mike. I certainly don't agree with everything he does, but he seems to really care and he calls out his own side when necessary. I also love what Kevin Hart's doing. He goes into inner city communities and he actually preaches and teaches financial literacy. And of course, the GOAT, the king of data, facts,
The Rock.
and empirical knowledge, Dr. Thomas Sowell. If only we could clone that man. Now on to the next part where the two have a conversation about the founding of America and American history and national pride and what that looked like. And I found this part very interesting.
There are some things that I think could be done well. For example, say you're teaching about very basic early history, you know?
This is where I wanted to get to.
Yeah, okay.
This is important.
So here are some things about America's founding that I like. One of the first practical liberal democracies, glory of the republic. Folks had nice hair back then.
Not a democracy, but a republic.
Right.
That's
Well,
okay.
I mean, you know, they're not mutually exclusive, and we, of course, did more to fulfill the promise of a democracy with time. But obviously, when America was founded, it was a slave state. 1 in every 6 people in America at that time was human property.
Can I ask?
Is that factoring in that we only considered them 2/3 of a person, Vaush? I mean, did you do the math on that?
You question?
Sure.
How many states had abolished slavery by the time the Constitution was ratified?
Well, I don't know the exact number.
9 out
But
of
I imagine-
13. That's not a slave country.
Well, then you could say it was a confederacy with portions that were slave
I think
states.
that's better said. 9 out of 13 had already abolished. There was a sunset moratorium for slavery in the Constitution.
So this could...
Vermont abolished slavery in 1777. We were on the way to eradication. We were not a slave country.
Well, hold on. I mean,
and I'll add one thing.
We were on the way, but then like 80 years later, it was still happening.
So the question is,
No, we still had slavery until like 160 years ago, right? Like, so, I mean, there's still a pretty big foundation of slavery. It seems like some states may have abolished it, but we're not contesting that like 1 in every 6 person was a slave. And it looks like they didn't actually abolish slavery. They adopted policies to gradually abolish slavery. That's what I'm reading right now. 5 northern states self-declared adoption policies to at least gradually abolish slavery. Pennsylvania in 1970, New Hampshire and Massachusetts in 1983, and Connecticut and Rhode Island in 1784. Sorry, those were 1700s. The Republic in Vermont had limited slavery in 1777, while it had still independent before it joined the United States. Okay, I mean, yeah, none of that really changes the concept that like slavery was pretty big. Is still a pretty big thing. I mean, I think that you could still make a really strong argument that America was founded on slavery. Considering slavery wasn't abolished until 1965. So, America was founded in 1776. So we're talking about 100 years later, slavery was finally abolished. So yeah, I'd say that, okay.
why, right? That's a really important question.
Economics, I imagine.
Well, yeah, so Cotton Gin and John C. Calhoun. Happy to go through that.
If you're enjoying this content, guys, chuck a
Interesting. So it seems like part of the motivation was that they may not have needed as many slaves. Is that
thumbs up on the video. It makes YouTube say, hey, there's something going on here. I'm going to recommend this video. And also, guys, just to let you know, if you hit that notification bell, you can catch the live premieres. Every single video, we do a live premiere where we've got up to 1,000 people in the chat, all talking about the video. I'm in there talking with everybody on all of the live premieres, and it's heaps of fun. So hit that notification bell if you haven't already. Back to the clips.
That's part of the kind of archangel triumphant of the wokism coalition is Nicole Hannah-Jones, Robin DiAngelo, and Ibram X. Kendi. And Nicole Hannah-Jones in particular, right, the author of the 1619 Project, she heretically says that America was founded on slavery, right?
It seems
and
like
so
it
part
was.
of
Okay with that.
But it's just not true.
I think that's, I mean, it kind of is though, right? We had a lot of slaves that were creating goods for us, right? There were, because I mean, that's where you were getting your cotton from, right? So I imagine whatever you used to make cotton, 1,700 tampons, cotton balls, cock and balls, probably t-shirts, stuff like that. All these things were being made by slaves. There was still like an anti-black sentiment, even in the North, and it's like some general sense. I mean, slavery was still very. I mean, I just feel like you can't say it for 100 years. It was 100 years before it was abolished. That's a very long time. You should make your own video and then react to it with the chat.
It depends on what you mean by founded on.
So she defines this. She says the founding fathers were in favor of it. Not true. George Washington wasn't. John Adams wasn't. John Quincy Adams wasn't.
Sure, and that's probably true, but then they still allowed it. So
Thomas Jefferson even signed a moratorium of new slaves coming into the United States. Ben Franklin chaired an anti-slavery convention in 1775.
Okay.
None of these guys were writing expositionally how wonderful slavery was.
Well, this isn't being taught to third graders, right? The 1619 Project's a little New York op-ed.
No, it's
part of
not.
the-
See, that's where you're wrong. The 1619 Project's being implemented as school district curriculum in thousands of school districts across the country.
That's
seen-
true.
well,
Across the country.
It's not just like a podcast. This is curriculum.
Right, there are principles of the 1619 Project that I think are defensible. First of all, we as Americans tend to think of the founding of our country as its legal founding, you know? But the legal founding of the United States didn't really mean much for a slave. I mean, it really didn't matter that much for
I don't
the
really know what the 1619 Project is. So
peasantry of the time, no matter what.
See, that's where I disagree. Because so when was the first state to abolish slavery? Vermont in 1777. Why?
Well, I mean, for the
because they
slaves
were
who lived
inspired
in-
by the Declaration of Independence. Things started to change in that year.
I have to wonder, is it not the prerogative?
yeah, I think that's great, but still, you know, it was 100 years after everything was established that we actually banned slavery. So it's like it's kind of hard to say it wasn't founded on it. It seems like we were at a place maybe where we were getting ready to like slowly phase it out, but it also seems like part of that was just like economically we had alternatives to slaves, so it was seen as more, you know, acceptable because of forms of automation. But yeah, I mean, and after that, like black people didn't even get freedom until 1965, or they weren't considered equal until then. So like, yeah, I think that there's still a pretty strong argument to be said. Like, you know what, we might have been founded on slavery. It's a weird point to make, but I guess they're having conversations about their founding fathers. Well, ours, right? But
And I'm not assigning this to you, of tyrants to make sure that the children who graduate from their schools find no fault in the nations they're taught to love.
See, I never said no fault, but you could be thankful for something, and you can have a holistic view of something and understand that there were stumbles and there were missteps,
Sure.
while also being pretty freaking proud of that something. How exceptional!
yeah,
this
sure, I agree with that.
project
What if there are
is.
current problems, like today, you know?
We should talk about those. Like we already talked about fatherlessness, government overreach.
So interesting there, and I'll be reading the comments, guys, and especially the Americans who watch.
I mean, I agree with what Charlie's saying. I think the question that Vaush is trying to get at is like, okay, because I like being proud of America, and that's cool. But the question is, like, are people today actually doing stuff about modern day racism, or are they just claiming it's not real? And Charlie Kirk seems to be somebody that flies in that camp, because I've watched Charlie Kirk's content before. Charlie Kirk isn't somebody who really believes in things like systemic racism and stuff like that. And then it gets into the question of when it comes down to, you know, the conversation about critical race theory in schools, is your issue, and I asked this before, is your issue with it that it's something that little kids can't comprehend? Is your issue with it because you think that it goes too far by victimizing certain groups of people? while at the same time blaming other groups of people for the sins of the past? Or is your issue with it because you don't want to have conversations about any racism or systemic racism? And yeah, and so you just kind of dismiss it with a reasonable argument.
The channel. How were you taught about American history? Were you taught to be grateful or hateful? And here's my perspective on this. From the Australian perspective, we have a very similar issue in our country, especially surrounding...
Well, you're all a bunch of criminals. Sorry.
The way that Australian history is taught and the supposed whitewashing of Australian history, in the sense that there are a lot of dark parts of Australian history that the Indigenous activists think is not taught enough. And in my opinion...
Yeah, I mean, like, there was a lot of, I think that there was like a taking away Indigenous kids from their families and forcing them to, like, marry white people or some shit or whatever the fuck. Like, there's a little bit of crazy shit going on in Australia too, you know? So...
History should be taught accurately. However, self-flagellating and teaching that your country is evil is not helpful to anybody. And
well, I agree with that. I wonder if people are actually teaching that, or if that's your interpretation because you're sensitive to criticism, you know? And so I think it's a little bit of both. I see people on TikTok saying America's horrible and all white people are bad, and that's wrong. But I haven't really seen anything academically that suggests all white people are terrible pieces of shit. And so it's kind of one of those situations too.
It doesn't actually help when you're trying to move forward. It's important to understand history objectively, and one of the parts of understanding history...
Well, it's hard to understand history objectively when the winning side, like, you know, is kind of the dominating narrative. There's probably arguments to be made that there has been a diminishment of the different atrocities that were committed by, you know, the dominating group, because they're the ones that wrote the rules. They're the ones that wrote the history, right? So... I think it's something to keep in mind.
History, objectively, is that it was pretty much a bloodbath and many terrible things happened, and that the place that you're from is not uniquely evil, and it's fantastic that we've made such progress as human beings, and we should keep on striving to make said progress.
Yeah, and we should still look back and look at this as like a failure of all of us, that we did oppress some people to a point where they're like failing nowadays, not because they're anything wrong with them, but because they had a denying of opportunity based on the color of their skin historically, and that kind of just sits in the system a little bit. I think that that's a decent way to teach people, and I mostly think that you should just deal with those problems like through money, you know, like, you know, provide more comprehensive different types of welfare programs and whatnot. I'm still a pretty big UBI guy, so yeah.
We cannot move forward if we are constantly looking in the rearview mirror, and if we're always just self-flagellating and looking into the...
and this again, like this kind of stuff, it makes me believe like it sounds like you don't want to have any conversation about systemic racism. Like, we should move forward, we should, but you have to look at the past, or else history repeats itself. And so when I hear you talk, I'm like, this guy probably doesn't want to have really any conversation about any type of systemic injustice on a societal level. Like, I don't need to be getting on a fucking knee at the grocery store giving up my place in line because the guy behind me is black. Okay. You know, but, you know, when it comes to more of an educated conversation, we could talk about it, you know?
Past, then that's a great way to completely just self-flagellating and looking into the past, then that's a great way to completely demoralize a nation. And trust me, there are a lot of people with ill intentions who would love to see a demoralized Western world. And in Australia, we have an incredible culture of mateship, brotherhood, hard work, and humility.
I'm pretty sure you guys were put there because you were all a bunch of bad guys. Okay, you guys were a bunch of criminals, and we put you there. I'm just kidding. I think that is part of the history, though. Yeah, I remember slavery was a net positive for them because they were put in America and developed abilities that helped them. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to make this point about how everybody's so well-intentioned about it when you have, like, conservatives talking about the benefits of being enslaved and how black people are lucky to be enslaved because they get to be here. And your response might be, well, listen, Papa God, there were some things that black people learned through being slaves that you can argue is a positive. I mean, I just personally wouldn't. They learned certain skills. They could have learned those skills without being slaves, right? They were also, you know, traumatized forever. And I think it's interesting because I want you to just replace slavery and black people with women and being sex trafficked. Would you make the same argument that women that were sex trafficked benefited in some way because they learned some unique skills that could help them in the future? You probably say no, but those aren't the same. Well, they're comparable. I mean, you're talking about a slave that could get beat to death just on a whim. Was forced to do things, forced to actually have sex with other people to breed, like they were cattle. And so, like, I'm thinking that it wasn't worth the things they learned, but you can't really replace that. You know, you can't, like, that's just I feel like it's just kind of a fucking, it's a desperation to downplay the horrors of that past by saying, well, there's some stuff there's some positives out of that. You know, take the good with the bad. So yeah, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't. You know. Because in the same way that you're saying, oh, you know, black people benefited from slavery because they learned skills, is the same thing if I said, like, oh, well, a woman who was sex trafficked learned how to please a man. Like, just saying that out loud disgusts me. And that's what you're saying about black people when you say that there were benefits to them being enslaved. And, like, understand that, like, the visceral response that you had hearing me say what I just said, you should apply to both things, because it's just a disgusting argument. Ooh, look at all these things.
Been essential in building what Australia is today, and at times extremely harsh conditions, and in only a few hundred years. This is a culture that resonates deeply with older Australians, especially those that experienced times like the Vietnam War. But the younger generation, they don't care for it at all. And honestly, I don't even like talking about this because it breaks my heart to see what has become of my country. But if the Aussies who watch the channel would like to see me cover this...
I mean, like, I understand what you're saying. People in the past, like, those people in the Vietnam War went through more than, you know, people nowadays. But that doesn't mean that there aren't things to fix, right? It doesn't mean that there aren't legitimate complaints to be made about some things.
Time to time, then let me know.
Income mobility here, which is the measure for how effectively this country manages its meritocratic systems, you know, is higher in some European countries than it is here. The idea remains valuable to me, but I can't help but think maybe we could make it better. If making it better entails some highly destructive process that involves tearing down everything we've ever known and such, then, I mean, eventually you have to do a risk-reward benefit, right?
So what I'm trying to caution you about is that the people pushing CRT or wokism, they don't have the same sort of nuance that you do. These are revolutionaries that want to tear down the system.
But I am as well.
Maybe? I don't know if that's necessarily true. I mean, it could be. I don't know. I mean, if they wanted to tear down this system, then why are they playing within the system to educate people through that system? I don't know. I don't know.
Just think that everything has its time.
You just had kind of a little bit more of a moderated answer.
But how often do actual critical race theorists come on, like, all of the, like, talk show circuits that end up... I mean, we've had some. I mean, Joy Reid advocated for it, but the actual scholars...
They're running Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman. They're running the United States military. They're running the way...
Who's they? What is he talking about? Trans people?
they're assigning these ideas. Again, wokism. Let's use that.
With Robin DiAngelo and the federal
white fragility.
Right. I'm not a big fan of her, largely because I think her language incites a lot of negative discourse. I think that it's bad for publication. Maybe good in an academic setting.
So not good to teach generals that.
Like for some random people at, like, a business? Absolutely not. No.
Generals in the military.
Oh, yeah, sure. No.
Because that's what's happening.
Well, the big problem that I have, but keep in mind, that's not wokists running these things. What happens is this, and put pretty simply, the majority of Americans broadly are progressive on these issues, support BLM, all these sort of broad cultural markers. So corporations and other large entities think we need to avoid a cancellation, we need to appeal to the business interests of this country, we need to do something to ingratiate ourselves to the majority opinion. So oftentimes, and they've done this for decades, by the way,
Yeah, I mean, that's still not good. I mean, if the argument is that these people don't have as much control as we think, it's just businesses virtue signaling to them to try to make it seem like they care. I mean, I get the argument, but if they do virtue signal too hard, you know, I guess things could go too far. I just am not really seeing this massive wokeism that's destroying everybody through teaching. So of complicated race conversations.
Is they find some consultants, they pay them $300,000,
Like Robin DiAngelo,
to come on over there, and Robin DiAngelo's job, first and foremost, is to convince everyone who hires her that she was worth that money. So is she going to come over there and write like a PowerPoint like, don't be racist, like, come on, be cool? No, she has to go all out. And what you get...
I mean, maybe that might be it. I guess the question is, do people actually take a message from what's being told to them then?
It's cringy, like the Coca-Cola PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Where you get, look, some of the things there are defensible. Does systemic racism exist? Sure. Should we be aware of the concept of like implicit bias? Yeah, fine. That's good. That's just normal human things, I think.
Sure.
But some of the language in there really made it seem like she wanted white people to feel a little bit bad. And I don't want white people to feel bad.
So he just casually throws
Thank you. I appreciate that. Vaush.
in there that he wants to tear down the system, but he's wearing glasses and what appears to be a white coat. And he has
Well, I think when he says tear down the system, I think that he just means I want it to be slowly torn down, in a way that some things can be changed. Like, I wouldn't use the terminology tear down the system, but like when you look at our healthcare system, we need a complete restructure of that slowly. And you could argue that's what he means by it. Whatever.
nice, smooth baritone voice, so it doesn't sound so bad.
We need to transition the system. Okay, we need to transition the gender of our system.
But interestingly, what he said there about the corporations is wrong, and it's just manifestly wrong. And
What's
this
wrong
is
about
obvious
it?
now. We know
do you
now
mean?
that companies are not doing this because of popular support and because everyone's woke. Companies are doing this because they have to, because of the ESG agenda. And we also know that BLM is certainly not getting the popular support, and that woke companies are going broke. Look at Bud Light. Look at these Hollywood.
I'm not understanding what he's talking about. There being a push for racial diversity conversations doesn't mean that they need to take fucking idiots in and to have those discussions. But okay.
woke movies that are just tanking and falling on their face continuously. And this was filmed in August 2021. So it's amazing to see how much public consciousness about this sinister agenda has changed.
It's so weird that it's so sinister. I think like everything else, some advocacy goes too far. There's nothing sinister about teaching people race shit. Okay, unless it goes too far.
We hope,
So that's
I
it.
guess. Needless to say, if he brought this up in the context of 2023...
And I also don't think that woke companies are going broke either. No. Are there some examples like Bud Light like taking a hit? Sure, but overall the people are making money. I mean, you could like it's still profitable to seem like you give a shit about different minority groups. That's why they do Gay Pride Month, like because they can see the value in pandering.
Charlie Kirk would be able to easily refute this. Probably bring up receipts as well.
But there's other nations today that have those values that we would never call fascist, like Japan. Japan has very strict immigration.
Well, I think Korea is actually a better example, to be honest.
I really don't like either of those countries for the reasons that I've
You don't like
described.
Korea?
I think they're both deeply conservative countries.
I
that-
agree with you.
Right.
They're
yeah.
wonderful.
And I think they do so in part because there's a degree of anti-individualism in the subservience they all expect of the common good. Now, it's funny. I feel like our roles are being reversed a little bit here.
Isn't that interesting?
The common good isn't something I appeal to. For
What is interesting about it? Because conservatives are very individualistic. So what is the
me, the value...
like you would argue that would be a step towards like some kind of communism or fascism or something when everybody's expected to like act the same in some capacity.
I want to
No,
maximize.
I just appeal to the good,
the good. Sure, the
which
good
is two different things.
is freedom. That's what I care about most. And that's what libertarian socialism is about. There are many types of freedoms, positive and negative. If I might indulge very briefly, like, is a man thrown to a lawless desert without food, water, or clothing free? I'm really asking.
So, probably no.
I agree. He's free to die.
But that's an extreme example,
Sure.
not applicable in modern wealthy America.
No,
or
but-
any Western nation.
But it's a philosophical base.
it's also a
Well, I think that he's just having the conversation about how some things that are too free can be bad for you, like getting a free 10-piece chicken nugget and then vomiting after. No, it's like, oh, there is freedom is too much. Like none of us would agree that everybody should be 100% free. Or like, do you think we should be 100% free to like, sleep with children? Of course not, right? So Are you fucking with my balls right now, dude? So, like, of course, there needs to be things that restrict your freedoms because those freedoms can be harmful to another person, and we've always been doing that. And I think the fundamental argument is that there might be some lack of freedoms in Japan that could be hurting in some capacity. That's not necessarily a good thing just because you look at the country and think that parts of it are good.
A Rousseauian argument. Man's born.
So just because they don't have immigration doesn't make it good for them. I mean, they have an aging population. If your population ages too much, then the young people that are expected to work aren't going to be able to work enough for there to be enough economic infrastructure to pay for particular welfare programs that are essential to the success of your country, right? So there's different aspects there.
Free, and he spends the rest of his life in chains. It's just anti-commercial in nature.
Well, no, but it's a base philosophical argument because it's true they're lawless. There's nothing preventing him from doing anything in that environment, but he has no ability to act on his desires.
But do you know what he does have? Consciousness.
Well, sure.
So that's a natural rights doctrine that I will defend.
Well, I mean, I like consciousness too. The only point that I'm getting at is when it comes to people's freedom and the ability for people to protect their freedom, this is what I care about. It's what Marx cared about. If you actually read what he wrote, and
I've read Das Kapital, I've read the Manifesto, and guess what? He was right about some things.
Then you know.
But not everything.
He didn't talk
he was really wrong
about equality. He didn't write on equality. He wrote on freedom because he believed that society was a very complex interlocking network of systems that in some ways liberated men and in other ways enslaved them.
But do you know what he got wrong? He got wrong that sometimes people can be free for other devices that they are not able to regulate. They can be free not from alcoholism, drug addiction, some sort of any other sort of perverse addiction. The idea of freedom is a very libertarian.
But I agree with that, though.
No, I know you do.
The greatest society.
I say that. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Just the greatest society is one where a man is born, and there are as few things as possible preventing him from doing whatever he wants for the rest of his life.
Sure, as long as he's not harming other people, right? That's the whole point of that.
Totally disagree.
So long as, of course, he doesn't deprive others of the ability to do the same.
Sure.
So I think that's a miserable society.
Why? That's a great society. What you're basically saying is, hey, I think that people should be as free as possible as long as they don't steal. That's miserable. I can't believe you'd have that take, Vaush. Why would you say that?
Freedom?
No, that's not freedom.
Why?
That's licentiousness or degeneracy. That's
How?
chaos.
What is degeneracy?
How's it chaos?
I like men.
How about pedophilia?
Okay. Well, obviously,
You said
that would
whatever
infringe-
he wants. Is
As long as they
pedophilia?
don't-
As long as it doesn't infringe on someone else's right to be free. Pedophilia does that. What? That was part of the argument already. That was already part of the argument there. We've satisfied that that's wrong. Vaush's argument says that that's wrong. But okay.
Freedom, Vaush?
As long as they don't infringe on the rights of others. I'm sure you could believe, I would believe
Well,
that.
so then,
infringes
so
on the
there
rights of
are
others.
limits on freedom, is what you're saying. It's not.
He said that from the start. Dude, wait, Charlie Kirk is getting dumpstered here. He's just not understanding what he's saying. Wait, he's just not understanding the words Vaush said, and he's like, you're so wrong. Hey, guys, people should be free to do whatever they want as long as it doesn't infringe on other people's freedom. Oh, that's terrible. Do you think they should... What about molesting kids? You think that's okay? No, because that infringes on a child's right to be free. It's just like he doesn't understand it feels like it's very basic concept. I don't get it. There's the confusion.
Not this Wild West
Yeah, well,
campaign.
as
So
long
where do you
as you-
get those limits from?
Well, obviously, you would probably have to have a pretty complex interlocking
The limit is you can't infringe on someone else's freedom.
legal system to determine what we agree upon is like a reasonable limits we can place on people's behavior. We have that now to an extent.
No, I know. So like pedophilia, bad.
that
right?
would be
Yeah.
a bad thing.
Okay,
'cause
kidnapping,
That would be a bad
Bad.
thing.
rape.
That would be a bad thing.
All these things infringe on someone else's ability to be free, which Vaush said from the start. Am I being gaslit? Did he not say that? Am I just a fucking moron? Like, I'm so confused right now.
Why do you think those things are bad?
Because they infringe on someone else's right to be free. All those... Kidnapping takes away someone's ability to be free. Like, I don't understand.
I think they're bad because you're stripping other people of the ability to do that which they will. With all those examples, you're inflicting harm on a person.
How about dealing drugs?
I think that dealing drugs...
You can make
is-
an argument for that because drugs are very addictive and can destroy somebody's life. And so, like, maybe you shouldn't have the freedom to sell drugs or do drugs. Like, you can make the argument on the fundamental basis that you should be free to do anything as long as it doesn't restrict the freedom of other people. So...
the person's freedom, as is taking a
But
person's...
you're taking.
What about dealing drugs to kids?
Dealing drugs to kids, I think I would disagree with that, probably because I think there's something exceptional about addictive substances and children. That being said, I think a lot of stuff would apply to children specifically. Contract law. Kids can't sign contracts,
So
but there's nothing wrong
do you see
with
what I'm getting at?
contracts.
Eventually,
not
you do
really.
agree that a conservative framework is necessary.
But I don't think that's...
Why would that be a conservative framework? I mean, I don't understand. Why would it be a conservative framework to say that you should be as free as possible as long as you don't infringe someone else's freedom? Which fundamentally, the more freedoms and less laws we have, the more conservative it is. What he's saying is the opposite of being conservative. Okay.
It's a conservative framework because there are other things I care about that you would always disagree with, like collective ownership of the means of production.
Yeah, I totally disagree. I think private property and freedom are linked together.
Which would give workers the most freedom possible.
So for a little bit of irony here, he actually was just making...
Yeah, I don't agree with that part. I don't think that we need collective ownership of anything, right? But the rest I kind of agree with.
In the case that children aren't capable of signing contracts,
They're
but
not.
he does think that children are capable of changing their genders. He doesn't say it in this.
I guess. I mean, this is a complicated conversation that has to do with medical diagnoses, and so I don't. So yeah, I think the concept is listen, children can consent to some things, and the conversation is what things can they consent to. Do I think a kid can consent to sitting down and signing a contract? I don't know. Maybe, depending on how old they are. I mean, you sign a contract kind of when you work. I mean, it just depends. You know, if you say like, well, can children consent to changing their genders? Well, for the most part, changing your gender, like, yeah, you can, because it means nothing for the most part. Changing your gender just means I feel a certain way for the most part. The conversation really, you know, if your kid's like, I'm non-binary now, I'm like, okay, I would just say, okay, and I would just like, it doesn't matter. Because you know what? Kids are experimenting, you know what I mean? That being said, you kind of move on and you go, okay, but then we're having a conversation about gender dysphoria. We're not having a conversation about just changing your gender. We're talking about gender dysphoria. Can a kid consent to like going on to like hormones? I think yes. In the same way where I think kids can consent to cancer treatment, kids can consent to other medical treatments. It's a medical treatment, right? That's where I'm coming from. So like that's where that conversation comes from. Right? It's like, what can a child consent to? And in your way of saying, like, and you'd also argue that allowing the person that is diagnosed with gender dysphoria and goes through like enough of like a waiting period in whatever capacity, getting age appropriate treatment, restricting them from being able to do that, that would be a restriction of their freedom. So
video, but it is one of his beliefs. And this is where, having listened to other things that he's said in the past, I begin to think that this man has a serious problem with duplicitousness. Like he'll say one thing to their face to appease them and to avoid conflict, and then behind their back, something totally different. And he's also...
But that wasn't... How would that show duplicity? I mean, maybe he is outside of this, but how would it show duplicity? I don't think that shows that at all. They haven't talked about it, and they didn't give him an opportunity to clarify. So, but okay.
A Marxist. And like I said before, you can say it in a smooth baritone voice all you like, but it doesn't change the fact that this ideology has claimed the lives of tens of millions of people. Sure. He can claim that Marx wanted freedom all he likes, and he can put the word libertarian after socialist until he goes purple. But the only freedom that has been allowed under these systems is the freedom for tyrants to kill tens of millions of people with impunity. This is a worldview that rejects individuals. I
generally agree with that part. I don't think that invalidates the rest of Vaush's arguments here, though. The fundamentals arguments.
Individual freedom by design. And now onto the last bit where I'm actually
like, if you're arguing that he's saying, hey, people should be as free as possible until that freedom hurts somebody else, and you might be like, well, you forcefully, like everybody owning the collective means of a business, that's a restriction of freedom, so I disagree with that. I mean, okay, maybe you could argue, I don't know if it's duplicity, maybe, but hypocrisy, I guess, but, yeah, okay.
Actually in agreement with Vaush.
Do you guys think philosophy...
Cancer is life or death, hormones aren't. What's that comparison? What are you talking about? I don't know, do you not like comparisons? Okay. Like, great. I mean, if that was too much, if that was too forced, and you're gonna put skull emojis. Do you think a kid can consent to flu treatment? Do you think a kid can consent to get a treatment for a cold? Do you think a kid can consent to COVID treatment? Do you think that a kid can consent to a Band-Aid? Do you think that a kid can consent to any medical treatment, even if it's not life-risking? Can a kid consent to getting their teeth cleaned? Can a kid... You understand, like, how, like, you... First of all, some kids will kill themselves if they don't get gender-affirming care. But you realize it doesn't have to be life-threatening. The point is that there are different things that people will get medical issues, and that kids can consent to the treatment of those medical issues in varying degrees. A kid can consent to cancer treatment. A kid can consent to gender dysphoria treatment. A kid can consent to a fucking Band-Aid. It's that simple. Like, the argument is completely correct. You just don't like the way that I said the argument. That's pretty much all it comes down to. So there you go. You answered yes. Okay, so your issue because you just didn't like that I defended trans people. I guess hopefully we've satisfied that. Hopefully we've sasatisfied that.
Could be taught instead of CRT, like Plato's allegory and the cave. In my opinion, stuff like this helps people better understand one another individually.
I think that we should support the Play-Doh set I saw when I was like 13 years old. It was a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles play set that my mom wouldn't let me buy. She said I couldn't consent to it because I'd eat the Play-Doh.
I'm hugely in favor of more theoretical classes being taught to high schoolers, philosophy, sociology, and I don't know what the modern equivalent of like finance is. Or
I think we should keep kids as stupid as possible because let's be honest, the only reason why our generation is so fucking miserable is because they're too smart and they're too self-aware. Okay, I remember there was a guy I worked with that was like 65 years old, nothing going on in that brain. He was able to stand still and just look forward. That was it. And he was content in his life. Okay? We need more of that. We need less education. That's why people are so unhappy. They're too smart nowadays. Even the dumb ones are too smart. Even the dumb ones.
Or home ec would be, but something like that. Kids
too fucking
graduate.
Smart, bro.
They don't know anything about anything when it comes to managing their finances, which is weird.
We agree.
Because that will destroy them if they don't. Like, why don't we teach them that? Philosophy, everyone should be learned on, just flat out. I think that's a moral necessity. And when it comes to sociology, I'm not even talking like left-leaning inclinations on that. I mean like the basic ability to read like statistical information on what's going on, because for the rest of their lives they're going to be asked to vote based on political information they don't have the education to understand.
Yeah, I mean, philosophy comes from a Greek word, love of wisdom, philos, sophos, and we definitely don't have that right now in our country. And yeah, I'm a big fan of teaching it. I just want to teach it correctly. I'd say a lot less Nietzsche and Kant and Hume and a lot more Aristotle and Locke and Aquinas and Augustine. And I think the problem is, though, if philosophy, if not, so Plato would say this. So Plato would say, I'm not going to teach philosophy until you could do advanced Euclidean geometry. It was his rule. Now, why would he have that rule? He's like, if you can't think rationally and be able to determine good ideas from bad ideas in the I'm not going to even get close to teaching you about the allegory of the cave or the ship or Plato's Republic or the forms. Okay. So I think there's actually something to that if you introduce philosophy too early, you can create kind of one-liner philosophers that think they understand the entire world. And it really goes to that expression, the more I know, the more I realize how...
Yeah, sure. I mean, I generally agree with that point, for sure. Okay.
A little I knew when I thought I knew it all. That's the kind of...
Yeah, I understand that you think hormones are different than other life-saving treatments, but like the reality is they're probably not. All the statistics and all the information that we have points to the fact that gender-affirming care is helpful for people. It's an uncomfortable thought, but it's just a reality. It's a conversation about like mental health focus. And I don't think it's a bad thing to engage in that conversation about mental health focus. I think it's a very positive thing. I think there's a lot of young people going through a lot of issues. I think as long as we make sure that we correctly identify these issues, that's the best way we move forward. And if you talk to any trans person, they'll tell you that they knew that they were trans from when they were young. And so the real issue isn't that young people are getting gender-affirming care. It's that we have to make sure that they are getting the correct care that they need. So that's really more of it than anything else.
That idea of daring to know.
The corollary is true too. You know, the scientists who worked in the Manhattan Project, many of them said they cultivated inspiration from religion and from philosophy, completely outside the bound of physics, but it got their brain a jogging.
This was an interesting part, an interesting end to things, and it's something that I'm in agreement with both of these men on categorically. The types of philosophy that would be studied might be a little bit different, but philosophy is very important. And also financial literacy and the other things that they mentioned. Societies that don't do this are really missing out, basically the whole Western world. And sometimes the conspiracy theorist in me thinks that this is intentional. They don't want an educated and critical thinking population that are able to think outside the parameters of the matrix, if you will. And perhaps...
Incredible. I mean, I would redirect that argument to ask, who are the ones trying to expand educational spending? It's not the conservatives. So when you say they... Are they conservatives? Because it seems like they'll increase, the amount of money, at least in the United States, of course, the amount of money that we need for the military. that's very important. But when it comes down for educational spendings, all of a sudden we don't have the capacity or ability to invest into that. And it's not progressives. It's not the progressives that are having that issue. It's the conservatives. So
Perhaps they don't want you to be financially literate, but rather dependent on the government. And they don't want you to be able to analyze data, but rather they want you to accept the emotional rhetoric. All I know is that I wish I had have learned this stuff earlier. Maybe I wouldn't have been basically a monkey until I was 25. And side note, Charlie Kirk always...
People do take a while to come into their own. I don't think I was self-aware until I was like 25. It was just one day you woke up and you're like, oh my God, color, you know?
Does impress me with his encyclopedia-like knowledge of the arts. A lot of the times, these highly logical, data-driven, politician-like personality guys can be a little bit stiff when it comes to discussing ideas that are a bit more abstract, that exist a little bit more within the metaphysical. And this part of the conversation reminded me that I actually need to brush up on my philosophical knowledge. Need to read some more ancient Greek literature. And I'll be doing so, and maybe I'll even talk about it on the channel. So keep an eye out for that over the next few months. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Catch me on the socials. Hit those links below if you want to come and say hi. And also, if you guys want to watch another video.
All right. Interesting. Interesting video.